Another sound, a buzzing or massed drone, roared over the task force at Tarawa at 6:15 when the Navy fighters and bombers at last appeared. In perfect formations, flying almost wing to wing, Hellcats, Avengers and Dauntlesses headed for the island over which an appalling curtain of smoke hung and fires burned. As the planes screamed in, there appeared here and there sudden bursts of flak. In other places, crisscrossing streams of tracer fire from dual-purpose machine guns swept the sky. Men watched the planes with admiration. They reasoned that everything was going to work out after all, and they took heart in the ferocity of the air attack. Disregarding the smoke and AA fire, the carrier planes, not just a few but more than 100 from Essex and Bunker Hill, began to blast Betio. Again and again they bored in. One pre-invasion attack was conducted by 80 planes, but Rear Admiral Hill was not relieved in the least. The late arrival of the planes threatened to disrupt the assault plan and tax the flexibility of the whole operational timetable. Apart from that, Japanese guns were still firing on the fleeing transports and LSTs. The air attacks appeared as merciless as the naval bombardment had been, with planes pounding pre-selected targets in deliberate fashion as they made their runs into the fiery conflagration beneath them. 3 squadrons of Avenger torpedo bombers struck the enemy's main gun positions with 2,000-pound blockbusters. Dauntlesses hit the numerous Japanese dual-purpose guns with 1,000-pound bombs, while yet another squadron of Avengers dropped sticks of 100-pound anti-personnel and incendiary explosives. The fighters formed a protective umbrella high above during the bombing phase, then zoomed in, strafing the beaches and inland areas with their multiple 50-caliber machine guns. The planes originally had been allotted 30 minutes for their attack, but their late arrival had shortened this to just 10 minutes before the warships would open fire again at 06:25. Fearing a rain of shells from the task force, the aircrews hurried their attacks so that their contribution was quite uncoordinated. Most of the aircraft were in and out of the area in 7 minutes, but a squadron of fighters remained aloft until 6:25 to carry out strafing runs. The warships held their fire, and the bombardment plan had to be further modified. The fighters had barely cleared the island when the warships began hammering away again at 6:27. Every delay in the intricate schedule was making a shambles of the invasion plan. It had been anything but a milk run for the aircraft, by any stretch of the imagination. Besides operating under the mistaken impression that they were not wanted over the island until sunrise at 06:15, the crews had considerable difficulty assembling after takeoff. Darkness and the lack of airspace needed to join formations led to hectic conditions over the carrier group. With so many planes in the air at one time in such a constricted area, just getting started toward Tarawa proved a chore. When the planes arrived, according to a fighter squadron commander from Independence, it was still dark enough for tracers to blind the pilots. To make matters worse, flak had been quite heavy, especially for the Avengers, which were given the task of demolishing the enemy coastal guns. Japanese flak batteries, rangefinders and directors were sited opposite the intervals between the big guns. This created effective AA crossfire zones into which the planes had to fly. Deck crews were stunned when 20 planes returned to the carriers with various degrees of damage, some trailing smoke and fuel, some riddled with steel splinters, others with ailerons shot up. At least one plane did not return at all. Aboard Maryland, Lieutenant Commander Ken McArdle had watched as the plane dived on a Japanese position. Coming under fire, presumably from a 120mm AA gun, the plane was shot down in a matter of seconds. One moment there was a plane. The next moment a stick of fire blazed down toward the ground. McArdle could not help but suspect that the crew had been killed, for there was no parachute. In any case, it would not have mattered. There would be no sanctuary for downed American airmen at Tarawa this day. The Southern Attack Force had been in action off Tarawa for more than an hour, when 100 miles away the bombardment of Makin began at 6:40, and Butaritari erupted with a roaring storm of fire. A deadly symphony reverberated over the island as the big ships slammed steadily away at their targets. The grey dawn brightened with the flash of their guns, but along the assault beaches and inland areas there were no great clouds of smoke as at Tarawa. Makin was in places swampy and marshy, and a rain squall had recently passed over the area. This moisture reduced the likelihood of a firestorm similar to that which the Marines would encounter at Tarawa. But there was devastation all the same. The battleships Idaho, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, and Mississippi fired tons of steel from their 14 and 16-inch guns at Japanese gun batteries protecting the main fortified area. Meanwhile, cruisers and destroyers leveled streams of shells into pillboxes, bunkers, and dugouts. Of the supporting air bombardment, the naval historian Rear Admiral Samuel Morrison, then a lieutenant commander aboard the cruiser Baltimore, recalled, "One could see coconut palms shooting up into the air, the trunks being separated from the foliage and the tops coming down like shuttlecocks. With steady fire control, the accurate Pennsylvania knocked out a trench complex from 6 miles offshore. It was later determined that the salvo had killed 62 Japanese. Rear Admiral Turner noted that the superb shooting considerably scrambled the trench, Japanese, and trees for some distance. In addition, buildings were flattened, and a battery of 80mm AA guns and 2 light tanks were severely damaged. Mounting a total of 12 14-inch and 16 5-inch guns, Pennsylvania alone pumped 403 14-inch and 246 5-inch shells into Makin in an all-out effort to soften up the island for the soldiers who would land on the beaches. Concentrated in the mile-square main assault zone in the center of the island, dubbed by Army intelligence officers as the Citadel, were a dozen concrete and coconut log bunkers and bomb shelters, 7 pillboxes, 6 5-inch naval guns, 7 pieces of field artillery of 70mm and 80mm caliber, 6 37mm AT guns, a mile or more of fire trenches, anti-tank ditches and barricades, and no less than 30 machine gun nests, including heavy 13mm dual-mounted weapons. There were also numerous spider traps, mortar pits, and observation posts. The inexperienced army troops heading for the island would need all the help the big warships could give them. At Truk, Admiral Koga and the impotent combined fleet waited for news of landings. Koga had done all he could. He had alerted his garrisons throughout the Central Pacific and called up the air reserves in the home islands. No one yet knew the true strength of the impending enemy action. No one had calculated, or could even estimate, the total size of the American naval forces. If the reports made by search planes from Mili, Makin, and Nauru in previous days were any indication, then the enemy's strength appeared staggering, larger even than the immense Japanese fleet that had sailed against Midway in 1942. And although the main attack appeared concentrated against Tarawa and the Gilberts, no one was really sure if there would not be others. Perhaps in the Marshalls and at isolated Nauru too. Everything now depended on the Japanese naval infantry holding the islands. With the Kido Butai crippled and the carrier air forces lost in the disastrous battles that had raged around Rabaul, the outer islands had suddenly become all that lay in the way of American mastery of the Central Pacific. These islands were now very important. From the island fortifications, these men of Nippon looked out to sea and contemplated how long they could hold out against such overwhelming enemy firepower. Chief Petty Officer Sasaki, manning his 70mm artillery piece at Makin, was worried. The garrison's float planes were long gone. All but one had departed for Jaluit the day before. The crew of the one plane left behind, and Emily shot up in the carrier air attacks and stranded near King's Wharf, had spread themselves out on the wings and fuselage and committed suicide on D-Day -1. Sasaki wondered why there were still no orders forthcoming from the command post. To be sure, communications throughout the island were out, but runners could have been sent out at night before the shelling had begun. That he had received no messages from runners must mean that everyone was at his battle station. But what of the enemy battle line offshore, now shelling the island with impunity, and the massed formations of planes? Sasaki did not know what to think. All he knew was, as he managed to write in the diary he had been keeping since the American carrier air attacks had begun the previous day, we were being horribly shelled. Indeed, salvos landed all around, showering the area with dirt, coral, and steel splinters. The explosions became so furious that Sasaki abandoned all hope of manning his weapon. For a moment, the bombardment shifted to somewhere far behind his position. He surveyed the carnage. Casualties among the gun crews were light, and he was shocked to find that his artillery, howitzers of various calibers, was still intact. Apparently, the enemy was mistaking dummy gun positions along the coast for the real thing, but he could not see how his weapons, protected by coconut log stanchions, could escape destruction much longer. The devastation around his own piece seemed to prove that. He decided that it was futile to remain in the open any longer. Sasaki took advantage of the lull to seek safety. He assembled his crew and led them to an observation post for refuge, some distance away. Nobody in the dugout appeared injured, but again and again shells smashed into the vicinity, making it clear that there was little safety to be found here either. Then, gathering up the personnel of the observation post, he wrote, "We all ran for the air raid shelter. They remained in the bunker as enemy planes came over, bombing and strafing." He moved to an aperture and watched. His frightened men beat their fists against the walls of the shelter in frustration at their helplessness. But there was nothing Sasaki or anyone else could do. There were more planes in the sky than ever before. Shocked, even mortified by the force assailing them, Sasaki wrote, "From both sides, inside and outside the lagoon, the enemy is pouring concentrated shelling and bombing into the area of our headquarters. Bombs are dropping by the score. Soon it seemed the island would break apart and sink under the weight of the enemy naval and air bombardment." Sasaki would not have been comforted to know that landing craft carrying the 27th Infantry Division troops to their assault zones on the hammerhead end of Butaritari Island were just a mile away. Behind the scrub brush and swamps bordering Beaches Red 1 and 2, all but a handful of Japanese defenders had pulled back into their redoubt, into the citadel in the center of the island, leaving no one to resist the Americans when they landed. Things were much different at Tarawa. With the sun rising higher in the sky, Tarawa was still there, squatting menacingly on the sea against the brightening horizon. All who gazed upon the island thought it seemed strange to find it intact after all the fury that had been directed against it in the previous 2 hours. To Rear Admiral Spruance, it was a symbolic first step toward Tokyo, the focus of much planning and preparation over the previous 6 months. To Rear Admiral Hill on the Bridge of Maryland, Tarawa was a task he hoped to be done with quickly. Though he was alarmed by the ferocity of the Japanese reaction, he remained confident. The night before he had passed a message to Spruance via a destroyer. "We had a fine training period in F8, and I think the boys are all prepared to do their job in good fashion, provided we get a break in the weather and tidal conditions on the beach. I have had a little trouble convincing some of my fire support boys that when I say I want close fire support, I mean close. The 2nd Division has done a fine job in their loading, and are streamlined down to a point where I fully hope we may get the transports completely out of the area in approximately 24 hours. They have been a wonderful crowd to work with, and I think they will put on a good show." To several Marine riflemen, veterans of the jungle campaign at Guadalcanal, whom correspondent Robert Sherrod cornered on their transport, Tarawa looked tougher than anyone has said. By 6:35, the transports and LSTs were in their proper position, and the naval bombardment began anew. It was incredible to behold. The earlier firing had been purely reactionary, counter-battery fire intended to silence the enemy guns, which had opened up first. Phase 2 was different. The heaviest pre-landing bombardment in history, it was painstakingly planned to methodically and deliberately reduce the island fortifications to rubble. The patterns would leave not a foot of the island unscathed, from the bird's head to its tail end. In all, 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, including Spruance's flagship Indianapolis, and 9 destroyers would fire 3,000 tons of shells into the island in 2 hours. More clouds of smoke and dust began to rise again from Betio, obscuring it from the warships. The minesweeper pursuit, slow and armed with only a 3-inch deck gun and accompanied by 2 smoke-laying LCVPs, started through the narrow main channel into the lagoon at 0646. At the same time, the first 3 assault waves were leaving the boat rendezvous area. Another minesweeper, Requisite, followed pursuit in at 700. The LCVPs and a whaleboat from pursuit laid smudge pots, while the little wooden-hulled minesweepers went to within 3,000 yards of the beaches, searching for mines, shallows, sandbars, anything that might obstruct the progress of the assault craft. The appearance of ships so close to shore startled the Japanese gunners. Despite the smokescreen and dust, long-range machine guns and light artillery fired on the ships as they did their work, but they escaped any damage. No mines were discovered, but the current was running fast. Pursuit charted the bottom and marked assault lanes for the landing craft by laying flagged buoys. Requisite turned to lead the inshore close-fire support group through the swept channel. The destroyers Dashiell and Ringgold, battle pennants snapping from the mastheads and guided by a Royal New Zealand Navy officer who had lived at Tarawa before the war, followed Requisite into the lagoon to put point-blank fire into the beaches and protect the minesweepers. The water in the narrow channel was shallow, which made it impossible for the ship to dash through to the lagoon until it was clear of the knife-edged reef. Almost as soon as Lieutenant Commander Thomas Conley began manoeuvring Ringgold through the channel, Japanese guns began dropping shells all around the ship. One gun in particular, its fire flashes revealed it on the northwest corner of the island, fired exclusively on the channel until it seemed that the valiant destroyer was running a gauntlet. Suddenly, Ringgold ran aground halfway through the entrance. In backing off the shoal, her sonar gear was torn from the hull. The sight of the troubled warship a mile and a half out seemed too good to be true for the Japanese gunners. There would certainly be no better chance than this. It seemed that Ringgold was the only ship the enemy gunners could see. In an instant, numerous AP shells ranging in size from 3 to 5-inch caliber rained down around the destroyer, and close. One of the first landed just 50 yards away. Then a full salvo of 5-inch fire straddled the ship. Conley got the engines going again, but not soon enough. He was easing Ringgold off the reef just as a Japanese gun crew found the range. A shell struck the ship below the waterline. Although it did not explode, the dud knocked out power aft of the bridge and made a ragged hole through which an arc of black water rushed into the ship. Immortalizing himself in the annals of the U.S. Navy, the chief engineer, Lieutenant Wayne A. Parker, controlled the flooding by shoving his backside against the hole until a mattress could be found. For his action, he was awarded the Navy Cross. Several rounds exploded in the air over Ringgold's fantail. One passed through the rigging, knocking out the radar. Others dropped nearby, blasting great chunks of coral from the reef. There was no respite from the Japanese fire. In the next few minutes, dead in the water and drifting, Ringgold was hit again, this time amidships. The shell passed clean through, ricocheting through a 40mm magazine, the sick bay and the emergency radio room, and into the midst of a 20mm battery. The hapless gun crew was bowled over in all directions before the live shell exited the ship. On the command ships, operations staff crowded the radio shacks, listening for any information. Through it all, over the TBS, came a steady flow of frantic messages. All who heard the radio traffic listened with mounting anxiety. Rear Admiral Hill's staff was stunned that the Japanese were still resisting. Within minutes, it seemed that all 4 of the ships in the lagoon were in danger. Ringgold's messages told the story. Visibility is poor. We are being shelled by heavy and light guns from shore. We are hit, taking on water. Our port engine is out. We are taking heavy fire from northwest corner of Helen. We are hit second time. Our 5 inches are engaging enemy guns. Ringgold was in a bad way, but still battle-worthy. She had been hit 3 times, although not all the hits and near misses exploded. The port engine was knocked out. Power to the after third of the ship was down. Her radar was inoperable. Her sonar array was gone, and minor fires had started in several places. The destroyer drifted toward the reef, threatening to block the way of any vessel larger than an LCVP before Conley got her underway again. All the while, Ringgold's guns fired back at the enemy. Nearby, Dashiell saw the danger and also began firing on the northwest corner of Betio. Meanwhile, with Ringgold bracketed in the midst of the enemy shells, Conley coaxed the destroyer into deeper water. Once clear of the channel, he ordered, "Full speed ahead." Ringgold surged forward into the lagoon, the crew fighting the fires and making temporary repairs to the hole in the waterline while under heavy shelling. Shells slammed into the ship's wake, creating great geysers of water and blasted coral. Miraculously, although a dozen men had been shaken up, no one had been killed or seriously injured. In the midst of the action, Ringgold's gunnery officer, Lieutenant Littleton B. Ency, had kept the ship's guns firing, eventually silencing the 5-inch coastal gun that had been the most accurate. A lucky salvo detonated its ammunition dump, which went up in spectacular fashion. The gun was knocked out of action. The LSD Ashland, a specialized landing ship with dock facilities, which had loaded the 2nd Division's tanks at Noumea and joined the Tarawa convoys at Fila, was next through the narrow passage. The destroyers and minesweepers, still under fire, formed a line offshore, and enemy guns fell silent all along the coast under their heavy fire. The high-bosomed Ashland came on slowly, followed by the first 3 assault waves loaded in the invaluable LVTs, nearly 100 of them in long columns. Lieutenant Commander Roman F. Good turned on pursuit searchlight at 7:46 to guide the LVTs through the smoke and dust that blanketed the lagoon. They passed through the channel en route to the line of departure, an imaginary line 6,000 to 6,600 yards from the beaches. The battleships and cruisers continued their shelling. With each salvo, enormous tongues of orange flame licked their dual superfiring turrets. Concussions displaced the sea beneath the guns, and the massive force unleashed when the guns fired bounced the mammoth ships backward. The roar of the 14 and 16-inch guns, the lightning crack of 5 and 8 inches from destroyers and cruisers, and even the 3-inch fire of the minesweepers delivered the mightiest pre-assault bombardment the Marines had ever seen. 100 shells a minute smashed into the island. The main assault forces had been boated and waiting to land since at least 0400. Now the lagoon was crowded with vessels stretching nearly 7 miles from the boat rendezvous area. Lieutenant Commander Good, tracking their progress with pursuit's radar, calculated that the line of departure would not be established on time. The LVTs had been expected to reach the line by 7:45, but it proved impossible. The distance from the transport area was greater than planned, and a strong current and choppy seas slowed the LVTs. In addition, Pursuit had mismarked the line of departure. Pursuit notified Hill that the assault waves were 24 minutes behind schedule. Lieutenant Commander McPherson in his spotter plane also reported their slow progress. Nothing could be done but postpone H hour. Hill pushed the landings back 15 minutes to 0845, but he was unable to call off the final pre-assault airstrike, which was already airborne and on its way to Tarawa. The fire support group was ordered to resume its bombardment until 8:35. Milling about in the lagoon, the Marines scanned the skies for the Army B-24s, whose 2,000-pound blockbusters would flatten the island. 700 miles to the south, at Funafuti in the Ellis Islands, Rear Admiral John Hoover, directing all land-based air forces for Galvanic, and Major General Willis Hale, commanding officer of the 7th Air Force, were both stunned. In the hours before daylight, a full squadron of Army liberators had been readied, and their pilots and crews briefed for this last big mission against the Gilberts. The strike against Tarawa was to be carried out from high altitude in support of the carrier-based strike. But in the darkness, something had gone awry. It could not have happened at a worse time. The bombers had been spotted on the runways for takeoff. All had been set. The first plane, piloted by the squadron leader, failed to achieve proper altitude and crashed into the Pacific after running out of airfield. The next 4 planes managed to make it aloft, though with great difficulty, and proceeded to assemble into formation for the long flight. Beneath them, however, yet another heavily laden bomber also crashed on takeoff. With 2 of 6 aircraft already lost, some of the crews aboard the remaining 18 B-24s refused to take off with the oversized and unwieldy payloads on the short runways, and the mission was scrubbed. Though shocked at the dismal performance of the crews, no one blamed them for refusing to fly the mission with such loads, slightly more than 4,000 pounds each. The payloads would have constituted the largest heavy bomber strike yet tried in the Central Pacific, with 48 tons of bombs. The 4 liberators that had managed to get airborne carried on with their assignment, but they were not even sure that the island they hit was Tarawa. It was not. It is believed that 1 or 2 at most found Makin, and the rest bombed nearby Mayana, or an uninhabited island of the Marshalls Group. This was to have been a great prestige mission for the Army. Major General Hale was aware that Holland Smith and the Marines were hopeful about the 7th Air Force contribution to the main thrust against Tarawa. He was also aware that the Navy was doubtfully watching to see what the big bombers could do in a tactical role. But the proposal to send the B-24s against Tarawa on D-Day had been flawed from the start. The distance of the mission alone made any tactical use of the bombers impractical, and the ambitious bomb loads proved too great for the short coral runways in the Ellises. Yet another crimp in the Tarawa assault plan had appeared. Pursuit and Requisite, performing as control vessels, marked the line of departure, and along the line red and yellow flags fluttering from buoys indicated the assault lanes. Ashland opened her huge bow doors and launched LCMs carrying 14 Sherman tanks of C Company, 2nd Tank Battalion. Each of the medium tanks mounted a 75mm gun and 2 machine guns. They would land in the 6th wave and provide the Marines with instant heavy firepower ashore. At exactly 0824, the first wave of assault troops crossed the line of departure, and the battle for Tarawa was on. 48 LVTs carrying 1,464 Marines headed in, with 5-inch, 40mm and 20mm fire from Dashiell and Ringgold roaring overhead. 2 LCSs, which would each smother the beaches with 104.5-inch rockets, marked either end of the line that lay parallel to the beaches. The second wave, 600 Marines in 24 LVTs, then crossed. Up to 8 more waves strung out behind them, and prepared to land at 5-minute intervals. In just a half hour, it was hoped that there would be 3,000 combat troops ashore, by noon as many as 6,000 more. Just as the LVTs crossed the line of departure, the naval bombardment lifted to allow the last air assault to come in. This was the original H-hour minus 5 minutes mission, which the assault troops assumed would pin down the Japanese until the minute they landed. The planes roared over the beaches, strafing and bombing, and were up and away again in less than 5 minutes. However, the LVTs still had 3,500 yards to go. Rear Admiral Hill again postponed H-hour, this time to 0900. As bad as things seemed, very few men realized that matters were to become much worse before the day, much less the battle, had ended. The Marines of the first wave could not yet see anything of Tarawa. They were still too far away. All that could be distinguished ahead of them was a boiling mass of smoke and dust. Otherwise, visibility was limited to about 1,000 yards. The destroyers were still dueling with Japanese coastal batteries. The noise was fearsome. The deafening roar overhead reminded many men of thunderstorms of mythical proportions, bone-rattling shock waves created from the massive concentration of naval gunfire rolled out from the island. Decades later, men would vividly recall the violent thunder of the bombardment. Misery had plenty of company in the landing craft, where the men, chilled by a strong headwind, were drenched by the gallons of foul, milky green and brown water of the lagoon that spilled into the craft with the butting of each wave. Though confident, from what they could see, of the effect of the naval gunfire and air attacks, most of the Marines had been boated for 4 hours or more. Their disgust with their discomfort was reaching its apex. One Marine in an LCVP of the 5th wave, loaded with about 36 men and all their equipment, saw a young corporal overwhelmed by a deluge. They were riding so low in the water, a long white wake fanning out behind them, that the swell swept over the side and into and out of the boat again. The unfortunate Marine sat in the corner coughing, gasping for breath, and covered with foam, which gave him the lurid appearance of a rabid dog. Such misery was commonplace throughout the little flotilla. From the moment the landing craft, especially the LCVPs, had left the transport assembly area, they had been filling with water. Correspondent Robert Sherrod had climbed down the nets and into a Higgins boat at 6:35. Within 5 minutes after we pushed off, he noted, a half-barrel of water was splashing over the high bow of the Higgins boat every minute. Every one of the 30-odd men was soaked before we had chugged a half-mile. Men heading for Red One were shocked to see the dorsal fins of sharks swimming among their wallowing landing craft, which seemed ready to sink at any second. The scavengers had been stirred up by the activity and vibrations in the water. Danger lurked everywhere, it seemed. The naval gunfire continued overhead as the assault waves bored in. With each rolling aftershock, landing craft would shudder as if struck by some mighty unseen fist. One correspondent, boated in a later wave, noted curiously that whereas the roaring canopy of shells travelling overhead numbed a man's senses, the explosions jarred you to the marrow. Upon catching a glimpse of the roaring flames and boiling cauldron that was Betio, a private was amazed at the sheer power of naval gunfire. Watching, he croaked in an incredulous voice to no one in particular, "It's a wonder the whole goddamn island doesn't fall apart and sink." In other craft, men who were not incapacitated by seasickness ignored their unlucky companions and the water filling their craft, and stood and cheered the onslaught. For the Marines who had not experienced the ferocious Japanese shelling of Guadalcanal, the whole affair was awesome and unbelievable. They shouted as though the Japanese were already defeated. Aboard the warships there were similar thoughts. A sailor aboard Tennessee observed the bombardment with detachment. I couldn't see anything but black smoke and flames from one end of Betio to the other, and figured that's what hell must be like. Rear Admiral Howard Kingman, who commanded the fire support group, was aboard the same ship. From the bridge, he stared out at the tiny island in disbelief, thinking it seemed almost impossible for any human being to be left alive on the island. On some ships, naive bets were made that Betio would no longer be there when the bombardment ended. In the lagoon, a crewman aboard Ringgold noted, "The whole island was ablaze. You couldn't see anything but fire and smoke. Every once in a while a great pillar of flame shot skyward as though a volcano had erupted. A sailor standing near me gave a sickly grin. 'Mate, they need firemen in there, not Marines,' he said. And I thought it's going to be a cinch for our guys. They too find nothing but splintered palm trees and dead Japanese." Another observer, with an astute flair for symbolism, described the maelstrom as the voice of doom for the Japanese, not only on Tarawa but throughout the Pacific. 100 miles away at Makin, the naval gunfire in support of the landings by the 27th Division was also astounding. In a bombardment exceeded in tonnage until then only by that of Tarawa, destruction was massive all along the assault beaches and inland. Whole tracts of mangrove and native villages disappeared. Coral, dirt, parts of entire coconut trees and dummy gun positions spewed into the sky, and scrub brush began to burn. In all, the ships expended nearly 2,000 rounds of 14-inch and 1,645 rounds of 8-inch shells against the island. The first wave of LVTs was coming in against virtually no opposition. A few rifles flashed behind the beach, a machine gun or two raked along the reef, but there was nothing of the intense fire feared by the untested New York infantry of the 165th RCT of Major, General Ralph Smith's 27th Division. To many soldiers, the amphibious assault had all the appearances of a rehearsal. In fact, the dry runs at Malea Bay and Kahulaway in the Hawaiian Islands had been more difficult. Major Edward T. Brandt, in a leading LVT of his 3rd Battalion, 105th Infantry Assault Team, watched as the tracked landing craft fired off their batches of rockets. Expecting to see the missiles blanket the beach ahead, he was disappointed when most misfired or flew off wildly, their firing mechanisms ruined by the salt water. Others fell short, but some succeeded in hitting the beaches. The 16 LVTs taking in the soldiers, the primary reason the assault proved such a welcome anticlimax, lumbered out of the sea in the first wave, sporadic enemy fire rattling against their fronts. Before long, however, the enemy firing stopped. The .50 caliber machine guns of the LVTs and supporting 5-inch fire from the destroyers, Phelps and McDonough appeared to have driven off the few Japanese manning positions behind the beach. Yet, although there was not the heavy resistance at the water's edge the troops had been briefed to expect, the landing was not entirely bloodless. Almost as soon as the LVTs reached the reef, one seaman was killed and another wounded by the enemy fire. The LVTs hit the coral reef about 40 yards offshore and, encountering no wire, mines or other beach obstacles, roared up the low embankment. One could see them, recalled the historian Morrison, crawling up on the beach like prehistoric monsters foraging for game, while the second and third waves of landing craft pressed in, throwing spray. The LVTs slewed to a stop amidst the scrub brush behind the beach, and infantry scrambled over their sides and sought cover. Once aground, nobody seemed to know exactly what to do, or where the Japanese were. There certainly was no enemy on the beach to put up a fight. Many men simply stood still, serenely waiting for enemy fire before hitting the ground, but not a shot was fired at the little band of soldiers. To Brandt, seeking the comparative safety of the backside of his LVT, the important thing was to organize his troops and get them inland. I jumped down from my LVT and stood straight up for 2 or 3 minutes, waiting for somebody to shoot me, he said. Nobody shot. I saw many other soldiers doing the same thing. As the second and third waves, loaded in LCVPs, hit the reef, they bottomed out. A dozen ramps went down, and 165th RCT assault troops of Lieutenant Column Gerard W. Kelly's 1st Battalion and Lieutenant Column Joe Hart's 3rd Battalion, the infantry commanders leading the way, surged forward into the sharp coral rock formations, the swells often breaking over their heads. Reaching the beach, they moved off north and south to secure the flanks of the beachhead, supported by Stuart M3 light tanks. At 5-minute intervals from then on, successive waves of 300 landing craft with men and material were supposed to land, chief among them 2,200 men with tanks, jeeps, AT guns, and field artillery. Everything depended on moving as fast as possible before the Japanese recovered from the shock of the pre-assault bombardment. The landing had been successful and casualties light, it seemed. Kelly regrouped his main body of troops directly forward of the beachhead. "Move out," he told them. The men of the 27th Infantry Division struck off inland. Aboard the 5th Fleet flagship Indianapolis, rounding the southwest corner of Tarawa after completing an independent fire mission, Rear Admiral Spruance trained his binoculars on the squat, unwieldy LVTs, making their top speed of 4 knots toward the beaches. As the flagship drew nearer Betio, she joined in the bombardment again, and the island shuddered under the impact of more HE shells. The troops, the men of the 2nd Marine Division, were moving steadily in, and Sprue wanted to watch. Up to a few hours before, he had hoped that the naval and air bombardment would make the massive operation almost superfluous. His Chief of Staff, Captain Charles J. Carl Moore, shared his confidence. Fires were burning everywhere, he said. The coconut trees were blasted and burned, and it seemed that no living soul could be on the island. The troops approached the beach, and it looked like the whole affair would be a walkover. But now, although the clouds of smoke seemed to confirm that the warships were finding targets, few men on the bridge were as certain as they had been. They had heard over the TBS the shocking news from natives who had paddled out to the task force that the tides at Tarawa would be low and erratic. No one was prepared to alter the plans, even if it were possible, and only a few were prepared to accept the information as the truth. Supremely confident of the men he had chosen to plan and command the operation, Spruance declined to intervene or inquire about the intelligence. The information, if it was at all accurate, had simply arrived too late for it to make any difference. The orders remained the same. The 2nd Division will attack and seize Tarawa Atoll. Thus, even more emphatically, it became everyone's prayer that the naval gunfire and air attacks would provide the margin of victory, that the Japanese defenders would be shell-shocked and incapacitated, their coastal batteries and field artillery destroyed, and the island cratered with massive shell holes. But with gunnery observers unable to see clearly through the smoke and dust surrounding the island, and frightened that the big warships would shell friendly forces, the bombardment was lifted at 8:55. The assault waves were still an astonishing 20 minutes from shore. The last air attack by Dauntlesses and Hellcats was similarly affected. Diving from high altitude, the bombers loosed their loads indiscriminately wherever they suspected a target. The unnatural darkness ruled out any possibility of aimed bombing. After making strafing runs, one after the other, the fighters zoomed back out to sea. The well-meaning air crews unloaded their bomb loads and .50 caliber cartridge belts as best they could, but not where they were needed most, on the deadly guns and fortifications behind the lagoon seawall. That the timing of the operation had been thrown completely out of sync was unknown to most of the Marines. Neither was it suspected that before the first LVTs would hit the beach, the Japanese would be afforded ample time to make the appropriate dispositions to meet the landings in force. But Spruance was not greatly alarmed. Unaware of the delays in the air attacks, and with nothing to rely on except what infrequent radio reports his staff aboard Indianapolis could intercept and piece together, he had no reason to suspect that anything was drastically wrong. The men of the 2nd and 8th Marines were heading for Betio, similarly unaware that the jagged, rock-hard coral reef might be exposed, forcing them to wade in under murderous fire. By now the island was in sight, and troops still entertained thoughts about an easy landing. But when the long lines of assault craft began to draw AA airburst artillery fire while still 3,000 yards from shore, it was clear that the enemy guns would no longer remain silent. The battle had suddenly become very real and life-threatening. As the naval bombardment dissipated and the planes left the area, H-hour was not far away for the men in the first 3 waves. The airbursts exploded overhead like giant firecrackers and peppered the assault craft with shell fragments and buckshot. Marine drivers controlling the LVTs of the 2nd Amphibious Tractor Battalion became the first casualties in the drive for the island. They stood erect and exposed in the open control cabs as they went about their jobs of getting the vehicles and loads ashore. In contrast, the Marines crouched low in the craft suffered few serious injuries from the airbursts. The rounds were too scattered and highly charged to be effective against targets so low in the water. Yet the Marines and landing craft crews would never forget the concussions and the hot grains of steel that stung their faces. At 2,000 yards, through all the deafening noise from the enemy AA artillery and gunfire from Ringgold and Dashiell, which alone among the warships had continued firing, another more ominous racket could be heard. It was infinitely more frightening and possibly more deadly than anything else. Japanese long-range heavy machine guns had opened up, and their bullets were ricocheting off the sloped, lightly armoured fronts of the LVTs. In a matter of minutes, a few vehicles fell out of formation, their mechanization and drives gone haywire from lucky hits, or driven off course, zigzagging crazily as their drivers struggled to regain control. An infectious anxiety spread among the men in the assault waves. The awful sound of the naval cannonade combined with the Japanese fire seemed to be right on top of them. It appeared impossible that men could have survived the holocaust of steel and fire that had flayed the island over the past 3 hours, so how could there still be Japanese firing at them, they wondered. Here and there, squad leaders raised their heads above the sides of landing craft to check the distance yet to be covered, and, disconcerted, ducked down again. Up ahead, close combat already had commenced at the end of the 600-yard Burns-Phil pier. With naval gunfire still roaring, a scout sniper platoon led by 29-year-old Lieutenant William D. Hawkins of El Paso, Texas, assisted by assault engineers, was going in to silence enemy positions along the pier. Hawk, as everybody knew him, had been commissioned in the field for conspicuous courage and strong leadership in the furious first month's fighting at Tulagi and Guadalcanal. Later, still at Guadalcanal, for days at a time behind enemy lines, he had led long-range reconnaissance patrols of the 2nd Marines Forward Intelligence Section. Since then, he had trained his men until he believed, the 34 men in my platoon can lick any 200-man company in the world. Long-range patrols would not be necessary on Betio, but there were plenty of other things to deal with. Machine gun nests were slung beneath the pier on platforms and protected by sandbags. Rifle positions were located among the shacks near the seaplane ramp at the end of the pier, and mines or booby traps probably had been laid. Intelligence believed that the enemy positions could endanger the assault forces with enfilading fire on either side. One rumor had it that the Japanese had rigged explosives to the drums of gasoline stacked on the pier head, intending to blow up the pier to deny its use to the Americans, who needed it intact to supply the beachhead. Hawkins and his men were supposed to land at the base of the pier 15 minutes ahead of the first assault wave at 8:45. Under the cover of the naval bombardment, they would knock out the enemy positions, clear the pier head, and drive down the finger to the shore. Yet their 3 LCVPS were nowhere near the pier when they should have been. The adjustments to the timetable had led to chaos, and the current had slowed the LCVPs. By the time Hawkins got the landing craft on track, much time had been lost. The delay cost the commando force their naval gunfire cover, which lifted at 8:55. Not a shot was fired at them directly until they were near the objective. Then it was a different story. Small arms and machine gun fire flayed the high plywood sides and slanted steel bow ramps of the boats. Second Lieutenant Alan G. Leslie, of Milwaukee, Oregon, commanding a 5-man team of combat engineers of the 18th Marines, approached from the west flank in the lead boat. The crew nudged the LCVP close enough for Leslie and his men to climb onto the pier, then backed off and began circling. Some of the Marine and naval officers doubted that Leslie could accomplish his mission. A former enlisted man, he had only recently been made an officer. Warrant Officer J. Owen F. Leopold recalled, on the ship they were giving odds of 10-1 against that he would come out alive. It was now 8:57. The boat with Hawkins and his section approached from head-on. They would storm the pier itself after Leslie and the engineers had cleared the seaplane ramp. Hawkins leapt onto the pier. The commandos were 12 minutes late, but it was clear that the first assault waves also would not land on time. For now, the forlorn entourage was alone. The fighting was wild and frantic. Again and again, Leslie's flamethrower roared, spewing long streams of flaming liquid. An equipment shed and another small building shielding enemy riflemen were engulfed in fire. Mortar shell after mortar shell rained down from shore, and 13mm machine guns raked the pierhead. Out in the lagoon, the assault waves were still about 1,500 yards offshore, Warrant Officer Leopold remembered, when there was a tremendous explosion at the end of the Japanese main pier. "Thank God!" someone yelled. Leslie made it. A fuel dump near the seaplane ramp had blown up. Marines in the landing craft cheered and slapped each other on the back. Off the pierhead, the commandos waited, circling. Japanese popped up from their hiding places in protective niches under the pier or in light landing barges moored along its side, and lobbed grenades and fired their arisakas. Hawkins and Leslie led the engineers across the broad planked esplanade, moving from cover to cover. They were peppered by splinters of wood from the pier flying all around them. Blasting the Japanese, the Marines hurled demolition charges, threw grenades, and fired their carbines. Hawkins used his grease gun with tremendous ferocity. The skirmish was as frenzied as it was brief. Some of the men in the LCVPs didn't wait for Hawkins to give them the word to land. One boat manoeuvred closer in, and Corporal Léonce Frenchy Olivier of Eunice, Louisiana, led 3 Marines onto the pier to cover the assault with their rifles. No sooner had they taken cover and let go a few rounds than the Japanese pinned them down. The Rigosentai fought fanatically, despite the fury directed their way by the small group of Americans. As his messmates watched, horrified, Hawkins hurled himself down the pier, with all the grim, heroic determination that had earned him a commission in the Marine Corps and would make him a legend before his fighting was finished. Some suspected that he was fighting not only the Japanese but hateful memories of growing up with the severe scars of a childhood burn accident and of losing work, of being rejected as a volunteer by the army and then the navy because of his cosmetic disfigurement. Within him seethed a defiance, a determination to settle a score of his own for all the difficulties he had had to overcome. A Marine sergeant recalled, "You see, Hawk loved trouble. If there was a tough job to do, he'd ask for it. Somehow he kept on going down the pier, 20 to 30 yards toward shore before he turned back. When the fighting died down, the scene was incredible. The pierhead itself was afire. The plank decking was burned and blasted. In all, Hawkins, Leslie, and 4 engineers and 4 scout snipers had knocked out at least 6 machine guns, and now there was not a live Japanese to be seen. The dead, perhaps 25 men, were lying all around. The furious fight to clear the end of the pier had lasted all of 6 minutes. The Marine commandos were the first Americans to invade a Japanese-held possession in the Central Pacific. But in the great scheme of things, their pre-assault action provided merely a footnote to Operation Galvanic. Hardly had Hawkins led his men back to their boats than the Japanese reoccupied the pier. 300 yards farther out, the landing craft moved relentlessly forward. The LVT drivers and their accompanying naval guides saw it first. So did the officers and NCOs peering over the sides. The reef. They could see the reef. In between the swells of the outer lagoon, the jagged, razor-edged barrier of coral was visible. A mere 3 feet of water covered it, and even that appeared to be fast receding. It would be close for the assault waves boated in untracked landing craft. The Marines in the LVTs were cautioned to brace themselves as the amphibious vehicles went aground with sickening crunches, some of them 1,000 yards from shore. They were jarred violently, and the men within them were jostled about helplessly. The craft, so ungainly in appearance, shuddered as their crews shifted gears into overland drive and slammed engines to full speed ahead. Treads began grinding and biting into coral. Admiral Spruance saw the LVTs hit the reef. Some of them stopped dead, their crews unsure what to do. Others continued on, climbing up the outer edge of the barrier. They alternately crawled and ploughed their way toward the island. As he watched, their lines became ragged and disorganized. Some vehicles lagged behind, and others appeared to be in trouble. For the first time, Spruance was alarmed. A marine observer aboard a ship off the lagoon said that the Civil War carnage of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg came to mind. Aboard Maryland, Rear Admiral Hill and Major General Julian Smith were also watching. Although the delays had been troublesome, it was not thought that matters were serious enough to cause undue worry. But when the LVTs approached the reef, things changed quickly, for the worse. The demeanour of the men on the bridge became one of horror, and there were gasps from the staff officers as LVTs came to a stop. They watched as some of the Marines leapt over the sides into the water and began wading, their weapons held high. Other LVTs managed to go on, though poorly organised and incredibly slow. It did not take long for the officers to determine that the worst possible scenario had become a reality. Many men were going to die as they struggled just to get ashore. In the large operations room of his massive 3-story command post, Rear Admiral Shibasaki listened to the sketchy reports and information about the American tactics received by his staff. Around him, hundreds of men, some of them horribly wounded and screaming in pain, sweated out the bombardment. The way the Americans were going about their attack, by advancing on the island from the lagoon, surprised Shibasaki, but the sheer ferocity of the naval gunfire was his chief concern. That the fortifications would stand up against such unbelievable shelling was something he dared not doubt. Yet the wasteland around the CP provided no encouragement. Everywhere the island was a devastated no-man's land of wreckage and blackened sands, uprooted trees and cavernous craters. Here and there, smoke from some unseen fire spiraled upward in billowing columns. There was no sign of life anywhere except in the lagoon, where strange craft, little boats with wheels, as the Japanese called the American LVTs, were churning steadily for shore. Nearly all above-ground structures, barracks, storehouses, kitchens, garages, were gone. Only ash outlines remained as proof that they once existed. Around the airfield, the hangars, revetments, repair shops, control tower and observation posts were gone or wrecked. The skeletons of several burned-out aircraft smouldered around the runways. Everything else, ammunition and fuel dumps, vehicles and heavy equipment, including concrete mixers and the narrow-gauge railroad, had been either incinerated or damaged. Shibasaki could not know, but nearly all the big coastal guns were twisted and broken wrecks. The AA searchlights were shattered. Camouflage screens and netting, which had hidden dugouts and bomb-proof shelters with great skill and cunning, were stripped away in the storm of fire. The communications network, most of which had been laid above ground, was for all intents and purposes obliterated, and the system of signal communications paralyzed. Betio appeared incapable of resisting the enemy about to land on its beaches, but the island's appearance belied its hidden strengths. As Shibasaki suspected, most of the garrison survived, and the men were even now emerging from their hardened shelters. They had lived through the 4 hours of unprecedented naval and air bombardment, protected by bunkers and pillboxes, covered by 4 to 6 foot layers of concrete, crushed coral and sand. Each structure had been strong enough to withstand all but direct hits by 16-inch naval gunfire and 2,000-pound bombs dropped from aircraft. By official counts, no more than 300 of the defenders were believed to have succumbed to the bombardment. The survivors had quivered and trembled throughout the pounding and ear-splitting blasts. The majority of those who died did so not from the destruction of their shelters, but from the concussions and unearthly pressures created by the massed explosions in so small an area. They were found in bunkers after the battle, crushed by the sheer pressure of the air around them. Though many men had cracked mentally and some committed suicide, most were able to sweat it out. Ensign Ota steeled his frightened men by reminding them of their sworn duty. The earth shook, he said, and the sky was a fiery ball. I stayed with my men at our machine guns in a bunker which covered a field of fire on the western lagoon-side beach. I thought of my family as shells slammed around us. We were flung about like rag dolls by the explosions. I thought of honour and courage and the Mikado. We had taken an oath to give our lives for the Son of Heaven, and this was the acid test. I told my men we must not fail, or we would dishonour the Emperor, our country and our ancestors. And so we endured. When the bombardment suddenly ceased and the planes flew off to the east, the tense break afforded the Japanese an opportunity to regain their sanity. they emerged to crew their infantry weapons, most of which they found virtually undamaged. Others raced to occupy rifle pits. The defenders positioned on the ocean side of the island rushed for the fortifications facing the lagoon, following trench systems where possible. Small signal flags emblazoned with the symbol of the rising sun appeared from rifle pits and through the firing slits of pillboxes and bunkers. Along the lagoon beaches and the positions emplaced around the CP, the tiny pennants indicated that defenders lived. It also meant that the attackers would encounter the deadly fire and bitter resistance of a determined foe who had survived the most heavily concentrated bombardment in history. But Shibasaki had no way of knowing how many had survived. When the shelling finally ended, he and his staff needed to make contact with far-flung units, but communications were out. The only radio that had survived the enemy's bombing attacks of the previous day was a powerful shortwave transmitter that could communicate only with the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo. Thus, Shibasaki had direct control only over the 300 hand-picked men of his tough SNLF Guard, who were veterans of the fighting in the Solomons, and now protected the area around the command center. The dazed defenders, shaking uncontrollably from shock, some with blood running from their ears, noses, and eyes, were amazed that they were still alive. Some still wore the hachimaki, the white headband that demonstrated contempt and defiance in the face of an enemy and unqualified willingness to die in battle. Samurai had worn them for centuries. Other defenders, scratched and cut, their clothes ripped and shredded, wore senimbari, or the belt of 1,000 stitches, made by women in the home islands and sent to the men on the various fronts in the Pacific and Asia. In ancient times, the cotton article had warded off enemy arrows. In World War II, it was worn around the midriff as a charm against bullets. Although communications were knocked out, each man knew his job and the ultimate task of the 3rd Konkyochitai to engage the enemy at the water's edge and destroy them while they were still in the water. Wasting no time, the Rigosentai began to do just that. The Japanese fire began to grow in volume as the thin line of LVTs closed in on the focus of all the destruction. Only the destroyers lying offshore in the lagoon continued their shelling, and hundreds of shells from their fast-firing guns whooshed over the heads of the Marines. Another fearsome sound joined the terrible racket when multi-barreled rocket launchers aboard the LCSs at either end of the assault force flashed off their racks in packages that careened through the sky, trailing wisps of white smoke behind them. Fired much too far from shore, none of them reached the island. Instead, the projectiles impacted short of the assault beaches. The reef ahead seemed to disappear momentarily behind a wall of bursting rockets and coral. In the bounding LVTs, the drivers and machine gunners could now see the deadly phalanxes of steel and concrete dragon's teeth and barbed wire in front of them. There seemed to be far more obstacles than anyone had briefed them about. In back of the seawall, the Japanese still could not be seen. Nothing was exposed, if not for the scattered gun flashes that stabbed the haze and the pinpoints of winking light ahead. The island itself would have appeared deserted. Nearer and nearer the LVTs moved. 800 yards, 700 yards. Enemy fire was growing heavier, but it was still irregular. In water that was 3 to 4 feet deep, the LVTs pressed onward as machine gunners began firing. The first wave was about 600 yards from shore when the Japanese heavy weapons, the ones that the Navy presumed would not survive the historic naval and air bombardment, opened up en masse, the likes of which had never been seen in an amphibious assault. Dual-purpose anti-boat guns cracked, mortars thumped, artillery thundered, and machine guns chattered. From all along the 1,500 yards of invasion beaches, Japanese guns poured forth a storm of fire into the assault waves, seeking a terrible and swift vengeance for the massive shelling to which they had been mercilessly subjected. When it became obvious that landings would occur on the lagoon side of the island, the majority of the defenders shifted, so that now in the center of the invasion front more than 800 Rigosentai, the equivalent of a reinforced battalion, were dug in and waiting. All along the beaches the Japanese had the advantage. Shibasaki counted on this to be decisive. He did not expect to stop the Americans from reaching shore, but in many places the reef actually jutted out of the water. It would negate any attempt at quick reinforcement of any beachhead that might be established. For the most part, the enemy would have to cross the reef on foot, and throughout the journey they would be under the sights of machine guns and small arms. Shibasaki anticipated that the first waves would be pinned down on the beach while his gunners decimated the reserves. The farther the Americans had to wade, the better. The guns had long been zeroed in on the reef, with exact coordinates predetermined and notched on the shields of the weapons. There, on that cruel and ugly barrier, was the sole chance to stop the attack. Shibasaki knew that the Americans would want to reach the island and engage the Japanese as far inland as possible. Behind the seawall there were more than 40 artillery pieces and dozens of machine guns. Ammunition was sufficient for only about 3 days of battle. Much of the machine gun ammunition had been shot off in the past few days during the relentless air attacks. Half of the tanks had been entrenched so that only their turrets showed. The armour stationed around the CP was ordered to move out. Trundling from their harbours, shaking loose sand and debris from themselves in the effort, 5 tanks left to find suitable firing positions behind the beaches. It now remained for Shibasaki's troops to hold off the Americans, destroy them if feasible, and await help from the Imperial Combined Fleet in the air and at sea. The Americans crested the reef at Tarawa in the lightly armoured LVTs that Holland Smith had insisted be provided for his Marines. The men hunched lower in their landing craft as the sudden impact of the Japanese fury became evident. In the assault waves were men who had survived the horrors of the fighting in the Solomons. Leading on the right and in the centre were the 2nd Marines, who had bled during the darkest months of the savage fighting on Guadalcanal. They had earned battle stars at obscure, strange-sounding places such as Halavo, Gavutu, Tulagi, Tanambogo, Gurabusu, and Koilotumaria. Many had actually landed at Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division and fought there throughout the entire campaign. On the left, the assault was spearheaded by the 8th Marines, whose jungle tactics had so harassed the Japanese in the final drive on Guadalcanal. Although every unit in the South Pacific had suffered from malaria, the 8th Marines had experienced an additional agony, elephantiasis, a disfiguring enlargement of tissue caused by parasitic worms. Many of its men had been stricken with the monstrous affliction in Samoa. Among the 2nd Marine Division also were units, and a few veteran NCOs and officers, that had fought at Chateau Thierry and the Meuse Argonne in World War I. Many others had been in action during the long armistice in the Banana Wars in Latin America. Now here was another battle ahead of them. This one, before it would end 4 days later, would go down in military history as the Tarawa killing ground. After the battle, Time magazine would trumpet. Tarawa gave the nation a name to stand beside those of Concord Bridge, the Bonhomme Richard, the Alamo, Little Big Horn, and Belleau Wood. The most intense fire was coming from a large complex of pillboxes and bunkers in the centre of the 2nd Marines front, in the 3rd Battalion's zone to the west and 2nd Battalion's zone to the east. Here, at the junction of Red 1 and Red 2, the Japanese had their heaviest concentration of machine guns and artillery positioned to create precision-sighted crossfire zones across a 1,000-yard front. Some Marines would remember the area as Hell's Kitchen, but it would later be better known as the Pocket. Fully 2/3 of the approaching LVTs were subjected to unavoidable enfilading fire from these positions. To make matters worse, Red 1 was the only irregular-shaped assault zone, indented with a deep cove. The boundary with Red 2 occurred where the shore straightened out again in a smooth, sweeping pattern to the tail end of the island about 2 miles away. Within that crescent-shaped cauldron, the Marines met fire so heavy that hopeless chaos was immediate. Aboard the battleship Colorado, QM Walker M. Gunter could see all too well what it was like for the men going in. I had a panoramic view of the invasion. As the waves of craft approached Betio, a shore battery opened up. You could see its flash as it fired. Sometimes the big shells splashed in the water. At other times you could see the black smoke of a direct hit. On all 3 invasion beaches, men met heavy fire as their LVTs moved in, but the assault troops headed for Red 1 never had a chance. Japanese gunners behind the seawall were almost eye level with the LVTs that crawled and swam into this beach. To the defenders, the ungainly, terrapin-like vehicles hardly seemed to be moving. Even over the most favourable terrain, the LVTs would have been no match for the battery of 70mm dual-purpose guns emplaced on the western end of the cove, or for the batteries of 37mm rapid-firing field guns and 70mm howitzers farther east. A half-dozen heavy, twin-mounted 13mm machine guns were also in action. Their interlocking fields of fire were devastating. The main assault troops for Red One came in aboard 31 LVTs and were very hard hit. 5 of the tracked vehicles were struck by shells and burned or were sunk outright. Drivers at the controls, trying heroically to coax the craft ashore, were fully exposed to the storm of steel and fire. These men were swiftly hit. Some LVTs had been slowed by the outer reef, then were unable to climb the shelf in the face of the enemy fire. The ones that made it as far as halfway to the cove were, for the most part, driven off course and channeled by obstacles and gunfire toward the extreme northwest corner of the island, the Bird's Beak. Some drivers, finding that they were unable to thread their way through the offshore jungle of concrete tetrahedrons and barbed wire obstacles, instinctively veered right or left, seeking less heavily defended stretches of beach. Trying doggedly to reach the shore, they were shelled fiercely. Here and there an LVT would be hit, begin burning furiously, then stop dead. If the men in the doomed vehicles were alive and able to do so, they plunged over the sides into the water, where they were mauled by machine gun fire as they started wading. An anti-boat gun stopped our craft about 30 yards from shore, recalled PFC. Richard M. Larson riding in a first-wave LVT. We were in the midst of all kinds of fire. We jumped out into the shallow water and ran around to the back of the craft. A bullet hit me in the left side of the back of my neck. There were 4 of us behind the tractor, and we were trapped there. They threw mortar shells, machine gun bullets, and rifle bullets at us. The driver of Private First Class, Newman M. Baird's LVT, loaded with 25 men of Company 1, was killed by machine gun fire 100 yards from shore. A lieutenant leapt forward, pulled the dead man from the controls, and drove the landing craft until he too was hit. Then a shell struck the LVT and it stopped 30 yards from shore. The men were bowled over by the concussion and sent sprawling all over the LVT. Stunned and under machine gun fire, Baird, an Oneida Indian from New York, looked around and found his assistant, who had been feeding the LVT's machine gun as Baird had fired. "He was crumpled up beside me," said Baird with his head forward, "and in the back of it was a hole I could put my fist through." I started to shake him and he fell right on over. Baird noticed that some of the men's helmets and gear had been lost. Several men were dead or seriously wounded, others had simply disappeared. Just 5 feet away, one of his buddies lay on the deck of the LVT. He was on his back and his head was all bloody, and he was holding his hand over his face and mumbling something. Baird took charge of the stunned group, shouting, "Let's get the hell out of here!" He grabbed his rifle and an ammunition box and went over the side. For Baird and the remnants of the platoon, about a dozen men, the horror had just begun. It would seem like forever before they got to the beach and found shelter behind the seawall. There, another Marine would pull an inch-long sliver of steel from Baird's back. Only Baird and 3 others from the LVT made it to the cover of the coconut log barricade. Though the fire was intense and the noise of the battle deafening, here and there men were coming through. The storm into which Company K ploughed was typical. Commanded by Captain James W. Crane, a Guadalcanal veteran, the unit was supposed to land on the left side of Red One. However, it was so hard hit that when its first elements touched shore at 9:10, the earliest of all the Tarawa landings, casualties already were serious enough that it seemed doubtful they could even establish a foothold. In effect, the company no longer existed. It had been decimated. Survivors who had endured a nightmare to reach the beach now were subjected to constant enfilading fire from the pocket. First Lieutenant Joseph O. Schulter moved to the front of his LVT with the riflemen who had been manning the vehicle's .30 and .50 caliber machine guns. He commanded the first platoon. To his right was First Lieutenant Wilbur E. Hoffman heading into the center of the cove with the second platoon, followed by Second Lieutenant James Fawcett with the third platoon. As Schulter came within 200 yards of shore, he ordered his machine guns into action. No sooner had he begun to direct their fire than enemy machine guns began responding from all directions. As he stood erect pointing out targets, a hail of fire fell upon the LVT, and bullets struck his shoulder and wrist. In the same instant, the LVT driver was killed, and his assistant rushed to the controls. Both machine gunners were wounded, but refused to abandon their weapons until the vehicle reached the seawall. Schulter succeeded in getting his men out of the craft before he fell unconscious on the beach. When he regained his senses, he found himself in the sand beside the body of his dead radio man. Fawcett came in some distance away from Schulte, whose LVT had been driven off course by heavy fire. Fawcett, a fourth-year Marine, had commanded a tank at Guadalcanal. Now the 24-year-old Washingtonian was an infantry officer. He watched intently as Lieutenant Hoffman's platoon went in. Several machine guns converged on the second platoon vehicle as men began leaping over the sides. Fawcett watched for Hoffman to get out but did not see him. He knew why when one of the LVT machine guns opened up. Hoffman had stayed behind to cover his men as they dashed to the seawall. Just as Fawcett landed, Hoffman's LVT took a direct hit and exploded, disappearing in a suffocating cloud of smoke. Hoffman and several wounded were killed in the blast. Company 1, which had been farthest away from the pocket, suffered less, but only by a matter of degrees. Its veteran company commander, Captain William E. Tatum, disregarding the heavy enemy fire, raised himself over the bulkhead of his third-wave LVT. He was trying to pick out his lead platoons, or possibly one of the shore batteries or machine guns firing on the assault waves. Although it may have been a natural act on Tatum's part, it proved an unfortunate one. He had been standing for only a moment when he just fell backward onto the troop deck, said a man who had been watching. He just sort of grunted when he was hit. He'd taken a bullet directly in his forehead. He was dead before he hit the deck. A coconut log barricade on the western half of the beach offered some protection from the merciless fire, but not nearly enough. About 20 yards from Shore Company I riflemen, some with their clothing on fire, jumped from their LVTs and quickly sought whatever cover could be found. Within a few minutes, some survivors had gone over the log barricade and infiltrated inland about the same distance as Company K on their left, to a depth of 50 yards. Here they were pinned down, unable to either defend themselves or pull back to the beach. Along the way they silenced a brace of dual-purpose guns firing from the bird's beak. As the fourth wave grounded on the reef off Red 1, the men could see through the smoke and dust a graveyard of burning, twisted hulks and tiny knots of men seeking shelter behind the seawall. The lagoon was under heavy fire, evident by the splashes of large-caliber shells and the traces of machine guns. It was into this inferno that Company L arrived. Their young and tough commander, Major Michael P. Ryan, of Osage City, Kansas, scanned the shore. It was clear that there had been a disaster. Red 1 was a shambles. More than half of the beach was still in Japanese hands. Very few LVTs were visible. To Major Ryan it appeared that most, if not all, had been knocked out. Only a few Marines could be seen on the eastern half, where by now there should have been hundreds. Little could be seen of the western half, where heavy smoke indicated that frantic close combat was taking place. Ryan grimly ordered his men into the water. They would have to wade to shore. The Sherman tanks that were scheduled to support the assault troops were held up at the reef. The plan was for a platoon of 6 tanks under the command of 23-year-old Lieutenant Edward Bale of Dallas, Texas, to land in the fourth wave as near the beach as possible, then crawl over the reef to shore. When the LCMs carrying them reached the reef, their coxswains turned the barges away in search of a gap in the reef. Overcome by the destruction before them, the LCM crews were milling about when the command boat carrying the battalion commander, Major John Schertl, appeared at the reef. He directed Bale to land the tanks where they were and take them in. The ramps were dropped and the Shermans were launched in 4-foot swells, 800 yards from shore. Bale, in his command tank China Gal, led them toward the island. Tragedy was swift in finding the special armoured reconnaissance troops who jumped into the water to guide the tanks. No sooner had they gone ahead to place flags marking craters and other obstacles than they were met by fierce enemy fire. Nearly all were killed or wounded. Bale led the tanks into the eastern half of Red 1, which was under the heaviest fire. The beach was littered with destroyed LVTs and the inert bodies of dead, dying and wounded Marines who could not be moved because of the intense fire. Rather than run his tanks over the pitiful forms, Bale decided to land on the northwest corner of the island. As the tanks manoeuvred in the water, buttoned up under the enormous fire, 4 fell into shell holes. One after another they foundered and sank or their engines were drowned out. Men came scrambling up out of the hatches and plunged into the water. Many succeeded in reaching the seawall, but some were cut down before they could find cover. Only 2 tanks, including China Gal, battered repeatedly by 40mm and machine gun fire, were still heading for shore. The loss of these tanks would cost the 3rd Battalion dearly. Shuttle surveyed the hell of Red One. Company L was wading in, and it was apparent that the volume of fire its men were taking was terrible. But that was the extent of Schuttle's knowledge. He and his command group began to disembark, but they encountered equally severe fire. Schurtel decided to remain at the reef and direct the operation from his boat. Before the first LVTs had returned from the beach, an unidentified voice, believed to have been a Company K Marine, broadcast in the clear, "Have landed. Unusually heavy opposition. Casualties 70%. We've had it. Can't hold. We're licked." As the 4th and 5th wave boats beached and the men began to wade ashore, the Japanese machine gun and 70mm artillery fire seemed to increase, and many shells burst among the incoming troops. Dozens of men went down and did not get back up. A bullet struck Sergeant James A. Bayer, a stunning blow on the crown of his head, just above the hairline. Blood gushed over his face as he fell helmetless into the water. The shock did not last long. Perhaps the water revived him. Realizing that to stay in the water meant certain death, he was soon up and moving the only way he could, on all fours. He reached the seawall and scrambled around a pillbox until he found cover. Coast Guardsman Carl Jonas and a shore party entered the water at the reef and immediately encountered groups of men returning to the boats. Suddenly, he said, we realized with a shock that they were some of the wounded. The shore party helped the injured Marines as best they could. The carnage was terrible. The dying men, fighting to keep their heads above water, were reaching up, like the men in the Italian primitive paintings of the damned in hell. The boat in which W.O. John Leopold was approaching the island tried 4 times to cross the reef with its load of 37mm anti-tank, AT guns. On each occasion, the coxswain turned back because of the heavy opposition. In one instance, a 5-inch shell exploded 10 feet from the bow. "It was just too damn bad," recalled Leopold. The tracers and bullets cracked through the air like pistol shots, coming so fast it was like popcorn. The tracers crisscrossed, and the whole area was a pattern of thin red lines of flame. Every now and then an Amtrak would go up in flames, and I saw 2 Higgins boats go the same way. Hundreds of wounded, weaponless, leaderless men streamed back toward the boats and reef, away from the wholesale slaughter off Red One. Companies K and I suffered the highest casualties, so % each in 60 minutes, and Company L suffered nearly as badly. Every 100 yards they waded, their ranks were thinned as men were killed or wounded, disappeared in explosions, took refuge behind burned-out wrecks, or simply turned back. By the time Major Ryan reached the beach, he had hitched a ride on an LVT until it was destroyed and the driver killed. The company had lost 70 Marines. Only 110 were left, and these were scattered and disorganized. By noon, the company's effective fighting strength would be reduced even further. It seemed that the 3rd Battalion had been all but eliminated. Of the assault troops who had answered roll call aboard the transports before dawn, half were now killed, wounded, or missing. The remainder were dispersed or held up at the edge of the reef. Of the 300 men ashore, only the remnants of Company Y were operating effectively, and they were out of contact with everyone. The assault waves had been reduced to forlorn little groups of men, fighting merely to stay alive against heavy rifle and machine gun fire sweeping the narrow shelf of sand and forbidding movement. "We swore everybody on the beach was dead," said Warrant Officer Leopold. "We thought no one was alive because we didn't see how any got in. I had asked the night before how many men were going in before me. They told me several hundred in each wave. That would be more than 1,000 men. I don't believe more than 300 came through unscratched. The beach should have been called Annihilation Beach," he said. It was red with blood. Schurtel contacted Colonel David Shoup, the overall assault commander, and explained his situation. Receiving heavy fire all along beach. Unable to land. Issue in doubt. Shoup himself was at the time under heavy fire off Red 2. He was unable to acquire a clear picture of what was happening immediately in front of him, much less on Red 1. He told Schurtel to land on Red 2 with the survivors of his shredded battalion and attack the pocket from the rear. All who heard Schurtel's distraught reply were shocked. "We have nothing left to land," he radioed. The heroic Marine Commando Force, led by Lieutenant William Hawkins and his scout snipers, had continued with the dangerous duty of securing the pier between Red 2 and Red 3. Not only were they still under murderous fire, but they were unable to navigate the length of the pier in their LCVPs because of the reef. They went to work knocking out enemy strong points among the pilings. In the brief time the commandos had before the assault waves bore down on Betio, they cleared half the length of the pier. Working under conditions of furious desperation, the assault engineers under Lieutenant Alan Leslie were similarly frustrated in their attempts to get ashore. Their boat became fouled on the reef and they had to back off as Japanese riflemen sniped at them. The engineers watched helplessly as the first assault waves came in aboard LVTs, rumbled over the reef, and waddled past them toward the island. When Leslie saw an empty LVT returning from the beach, he waved it down and ordered its wild-eyed driver to take the engineers into the battle. The difficulties that Leslie encountered in finding a ride were no worse than those that held up Hawkins and his men. The LCVP carrying the scout snipers in ahead of the assault waves had been machine-gunned. The fire indicated that the gun was located beneath the pier. Hawkins made several passes but found nothing. He set about finding a way to get to the beach. When the boat grounded, he commandeered an outbound LVT. The Japanese, seeing the LVT working its way down the pier, singled it out for special attention. Gears grinding and treads clanking, the LVT was immediately taken under fire by an anti-boat gun, which straddled it with several near misses. Small arms and machine gun fire raked its sides. Again and again mortar rounds rained down, spraying the vehicle with shell and coral fragments. The LVT machine gunner poured a steady stream of lead into the pier at point-blank range as the driver tried to maneuver close to shore. The scene was savage. The LVT gunner kept up his intensive fire until he fell over dead, his chest blasted open by a machine gun burst. Hawkins leapt forward and took over the weapon. In a matter of minutes, the LVT crashed through a spur in the seawall and up onto the base of the pier. Some of the scout snipers did not wait for the craft to clear the narrow beach before vaulting over the sides. Said a lieutenant of Hawkins, he was a madman. He cleaned out 6 machine gun nests, with 2 to 6 Japanese in each nest. I'll never forget the picture of him standing on that LVT, riding around with 1,000,000 bullets a minute whistling by his ears, just shooting Japanese. I never saw such a man in my life. The commandos plunged into the smoke of the explosions and fire sweeping the base of the pier. They rushed into a no-man's land of trenches, rifle pits and buildings. Mortar rounds fell in their midst, and small arms and Nambu fire poured out to oppose them. Out front, the commandos dived for cover, pulled themselves up and advanced again and again. Bullets whined. Sergeant Francis P. Morgan of Salem, Oregon, went down mortally wounded, shot in the throat, said a corporal. He was bleeding like hell, and saying in a low voice, "Help me! Help me!" I had to turn my head. By the end of the day, casualties among the commandos would be almost a third. Hawkins himself would be one, but nightfall would find him still fighting despite a shoulder wound from the shrapnel of a shattering mortar blast. He would not be alone. Although only one of their number had been killed, several of the scout snipers had been wounded to one degree or another, and all of them were fighting on. The dozen first-wave LVTs leading the 2nd Battalion into Red 2, which extended from the eastern curve of the cove to the central pier, were also hit by all types of gunfire. Some were disabled and came to a stop, starkly silhouetted in the sights of enemy guns that zeroed in on them. Others went wildly off course, drivers dead, controls mangled, occupants helpless to do anything but wait for the craft to stop. Eventually they would crash into the seawall, become tangled in dense barbed wire jungles, smash into some other form of barricade, or end up on the wrong beach, if they were not knocked out first. LVTs spilled shocked, wounded, and dead men indiscriminately. In the centre of the attack, there was nowhere to manoeuvre forward to avoid the flanking fire from the pocket. The whole area ahead was swept by machine guns placed in pillboxes all along the seawall on Red 2, no more than 30 yards from the water's edge. These positions kept the narrow strip of sand and the reef under saturating fire. Before the first LVTs beached at 0917, many drivers and gunners had been either killed or wounded. As the amphibious craft were hit, crews and assault troops went over the sides. Once in the water, their chances of survival lessened dramatically again. Staff Sergeant William J. Borderland's LVT, carrying Captain Warren Lefty Morris, the 25-year-old Company F commander from Arkansas, and a flamethrower and demolitions platoon of the 1st Battalion, 18th Marines, was blown out of the water 20 yards from shore. Hit successively by several shells, it was finally rent apart in a tremendous blast. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived. Bordelon, an assault engineer from San Antonio, had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. Now he led 4 others, including Morris, in salvaging what they could. They climbed out of the twisted wreck and started wading. By the time Bordelon, Sergeant Eldon H. Beers of Deer Park, Washington and PFC, Jack G. Ashworth of Los Angeles reached the island, they and the company commander had become separated. The other survivor had been killed. The second wave LVT, carrying Major Henry C. Drews from Jersey City, New Jersey, commanding the 2nd LVT Battalion, made 3 tries to get ashore, only to be driven back on each occasion by hostile fire. As shells exploded all about his vehicle, Drews, standing beside the machine gun in the cupola, made light of each burst and the fierce Japanese opposition with a smile or humorous gesture. The former insurance salesman was killed by a bullet through his head and was dead before he could have possibly known what hit him. He died, the men with him said, with a grin on his big ruddy face. Drews's executive officer, Captain Henry G. Lawrence of Albany, Georgia, succeeded him. He was convinced that quickly few defenders had been killed or were shell-shocked. He watched dumbstruck as his vehicles were hit by shell fire. Small arms rounds came through the sides of his vehicle. As the craft bored in on the beach, he was amazed to see enemy troops standing on the beach and seawall, throwing grenades. His driver was killed and the LVT disabled. His crew chief had his hand blown off while throwing an enemy grenade out of the vehicle. Lawrence put a tourniquet, a piece of hemp line, on the man's arm. He took control of the damaged LVT and ran it over barbed wire entanglements just off the beach. Marines ahead crouched behind the seawall. Some were up and over it, engaging the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Japanese and American dead lay on the beach and in the water. Japanese also lobbed grenades into another first-wave LVT, coined the old lady by her crew, as it lumbered up to the seawall. Corporal John J. Spillane, a semi-pro baseball pitcher before the war, scooped up the first one and threw it at the seawall, then grabbed others and flung them back. One he caught in mid-air. He snared a third, fourth and fifth and threw them at the Japanese. Screams were heard behind the seawall. A machine gun ceased firing. A 6th grenade tumbled into the old lady and he snatched it up, but his luck had run out. It detonated, tearing his pitching hand to shreds. The men tended his wound as best they could, then clambered over the sides of the LVT and into the fight. For Spillane, the war was over. A surgeon later amputated his ruined right hand. 500 yards from shore, 23-year-old Corporal Byron D. Beckwith of Greenwood, Mississippi, a machine gunner aboard a first-wave LVT, directed .50 fire left and right, trying to keep the enemy pinned down. Beckwith fired until his gun thwarted him. When it jammed 400 yards out, he moved the rear-mounted .30 to the forward gun mount. Enemy fire poured in from the front and flanks and penetrated the sides of the LVT, killing and wounding men in the troop compartment and disabling the light machine gun. Beckwith remained fully exposed behind the useless weapon as encouragement to the Marines about to leap into the fight. He remained there until he was shot from his perch. A bullet struck him in the thigh, someone driving a hot spike all the way through. Corporal O.B.E. Newcomb, a 34-year-old combat photographer from Westchester, New York, was going into action for the first time. He was amazed that the 26 assault troops in his first wave LVT were wisecracking on the way in. With mortal danger ahead of them, shells dropping around them, and bullets ricocheting off the LVT's frontal armor, these veterans of Guadalcanal harassed Newcomb about getting their pictures in Life or Look magazines. "Anybody want to buy a good watch?" asked one. Another young Marine quipped, "I forgot my rubbers. Hope I don't get my feet wet." 5 men were killed before the LVT reached the beach. Another died just as the vehicle landed and took a direct hit. All along the front, the chaos and confusion among the American ranks seemed to whip the Japanese into an increased frenzy of firing. The Marines had but one aim: to get through the water, cross hundreds of yards of the obstacle-strewn reef, rush the narrow sand shelf, and then take shelter behind the dubious cover of the seawall. Unable to run in the knee-deep water, burdened by their gear, hundreds were caught in crisscrossing machine gun and small arms fire. Company F, landing on the left half of Red 2, was severely disorganized. Shaken and under heavy fire, its survivors could do little more than dig in where they landed near the base of the pier. Some Marines reached the seawall and took cover behind it. A few crawled over it and moved inland. At no point did they gain more than 75 yards. From hidden dugouts, from pillboxes just behind the seawall, and from the tops of trees, Japanese fired relentlessly into the men lying exposed in the coral sand. Company E was able to establish a toehold, but at tremendous cost. In scenes reminiscent of Verdun and the Somme in World War I, men had fallen in uniform rows as they tried to cross the seawall. Small pockets of others huddled here and there behind it. Meanwhile, Company G landed in the centre of the sector and was immediately pinned down. Unable to move, the men had no opportunity to organise, so in pairs and threes, sometimes just one rifleman, they dug in. Only a handful were able to climb over the seawall. First Lieutenant Philip J. Doyle leapt from his LVT near a pillbox. The Company G platoon leader from Neola, Iowa, scrambled to the top of the seawall and single-handedly charged. He threw a grenade into the pillbox, then jumped in with the enemy. He killed 4 of them, one after another, with his carbine before they could shoot him. Everywhere Marines were learning that they had landed in assault zones other than the ones to which they had been assigned. The collapse of the assault plan was reflected in the experience of Captain Morris, the Company F commander. Taking a head count, he found that he had under his control 6 men from his own company, 16 from Company E, 10 from Company C, and 15 from Company H. Some had landed 500 yards from their assigned sectors. Numerous platoons, scheduled to land on Red 2 and fight westward toward the pocket, discovered themselves east of the strong point, in a wholly isolated strip of fire-swept sand in the centre of the beach that was the hell of Red 1. Similarly, an H Company medium machine gun platoon was driven off course by heavy fire and ended up on Red 3. To complicate the confusion, every small group, no matter where it landed along the 300-yard front on Red 2, found itself pinned down by enemy fire and without communications. One of the first platoons to reach the beach was that of Second Lieutenant Tiove H. Ivory. His LVT was caught in a beam of machine gun fire that the Japanese kept up all the way in. Suddenly, slugs began penetrating the unarmoured sides of the vehicle. Horrified, Ivory shouted to his men to get out. As the LVT hit the beach, those who were not dead or injured went over the sides. Ivory was hit in one arm by a bullet, and no sooner had he dropped to the sand than a grenade exploded and shattered his right leg. His men propped him up against the seawall. In shock, weak from loss of blood, he somehow remained in command. Others were not so fortunate. Men were killed by the score throughout the area marked by the reef, central pier, and northwest corner of the island. Among the dead off Red 2 was 29-year-old Lieutenant Colum Herbert Amy, the confident 2nd Battalion commander from Pennsylvania. He had commandeered an LVT that took him and half his command group to within several hundred yards of shore before it was stopped by barbed wire and hit by a shell. "Come on, let's go," he thundered while leading the 18 men into the water and splashing forward, gesturing memorably toward shore with his .45 caliber Colt automatic. "Those bastards can't stop us." Hardly had he taken another breath than he was hit by machine gun fire, which ripped open his chest and stomach. The courageous battalion commander was killed instantly. Shortly before he died, Amy had turned to Associated Press correspondent William P. Hipple and said, "I suppose you got a story. Guess the Japanese want a scrap." Hipple and the rest of the group now found themselves in a crossfire from the right and left. Machine guns, rifles, and occasionally heavy-caliber automatic weapons. "The bullets hissed in the water alongside all of us," he said. "As the water was now shallower, most of us got down on our hands and knees. We made spurts upright. My head was knocked back slightly. I felt the top of my steel helmet, and it was red hot where a bullet had creased it. I dived completely underwater, as I did many times afterward, and tried to swim submerged as far as possible." Amy had been in the lead when he went down. Only 9 men, half of the group, reached shore. It was like being completely suspended, like being under a strong anesthetic, not asleep, not even in a nightmare, but just having everything stop, except pain and fear and death, said Lieutenant Commander Patrick Grogan, who observed the macabre scene from his fourth-wave boat. I was afraid. Everybody was afraid, and no one was too proud to admit it. Those who were hit and were still able to move dragged themselves to the water's edge and lay there. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander B. Swencheski, commanding the 2nd Tank Battalion, was blown out of his vehicle into 3 feet of water. Severely wounded and deep in shock, he was alone and in danger of drowning. He could not reach the water's edge. All about him small islands of dead bodies dotted the reef. Swencheski did the only thing he could think of. With great effort he crawled on top of one of the ghastly cairns of American dead and lay there. He closed his eyes. He would be found there 36 hours later, raving but somehow still alive. Not only were most of the LVTs knocked out, wrecked or disabled, but soon the twisted wrecks of other types of vehicles contributed to the fearsome seascape. Landing boats piled up on the reef and were blown apart by gunfire. Before long they were joined by tanks, bulldozers and half-tracks, most of which had had their engines drowned out or had been sunk in deep water. All along the pier, and in some places up to the base of the seawall, thousands of dead fish floated. Gilbert Bundy, of New York, a civilian artist for King Features Syndicate on his first combat assignment, transferred to an LVT at the line of departure. He got to within 200 yards of the shore when the craft was hit successively by 3-inch naval shells. Miraculously, it did not sink. However, 21 of the 23 men aboard were killed instantly. Only 2, Bundy and a badly wounded private, survived. I was standing in the starboard rear behind 3 Marines, all of whom were killed outright and blown over me, recalled Bundy. The weight of their lifeless bodies pinned him in the horrific human wreckage on the deck. Freeing an arm, Bundy opened his first aid kit and sprinkled sulphur powder into the other survivors' wounds. After struggling for 2 hours, he eventually freed himself from the pile of dead and pulled the wounded Marine inside the LVT's battered cupola. Here the 2 men sat throughout the rest of the day, as the smouldering craft drifted out of control, and Japanese machine guns periodically raked its sides. The men were later rescued, but not before Bundy was mistaken for a Japanese and nearly shot by an LVT salvage crew. Robert Sherrod and 15 other men flagged down an LVT, which took them in part of the way. They went over the side into neck-deep water. No sooner had their feet hit the coral than as many as 6 machine guns were firing at the group of men. Numbed by fear, Sherrod watched as bullets hit all around him, 6 inches to the left or 6 inches to the right. Wading on, he was scared, as I had never been scared before, but finally Sherrod pulled himself into the shelter of the stanchions under the pier 400 yards from shore. Bullets splashed around him like raindrops in a water barrel. Within 30 minutes, the 2nd Battalion had been badly beaten. 29 LVTs had started in. 3 were lost in fiery blasts that killed every man in them. 3 others were sunk in chest-deep water, and 2 were disabled and crashed. 1 entire company had been put out of action. It actually ceased to exist, and 2 others were in grievous condition. In all, less than half of the battalion had completed the journey from the edge of the reef to the beach. Casualties in the 3 assault companies were 30%. Many of their officers had been killed or wounded or were missing. In Company E alone, 5 of 6 officers were killed and the other wounded. The men, often without weapons and in shock, huddled at the base of the seawall all morning. Major Harold K. Throneson, a former raider who had been at Midway and Guadalcanal and in the Russells, was part of Amy's command group. He returned to the reef to bring in 81mm mortars, which were desperately needed. This meant that Captain Morris was not merely the only company commander ashore on Red 2, he was also the highest-ranking remaining officer of the entire 2nd Battalion. He was with his understrength composite company behind the seawall. Thus, Lieutenant Column Walter Bupin Jordan, an observer from the 4th Marine Division, assumed command of the battalion. Jordan, who would later distinguish himself in command of the 24th Marines at Iwo Jima, was stunned to find himself suddenly the senior officer on Red 2. At 1000, he set up his CP in a shell hole in the centre of the sector and tried to establish communications. Behind him, chaos and confusion reigned. The fourth and fifth waves had arrived in their boats. All along the reef, the lowering of their ramps attracted furious Japanese fire as Marines jumped into water 4 to 8 feet deep. Jordan sent out the word, "Situation bad, we need help."